October 27, 1962, 10:52 a.m., 150 meters below the surface of the Caribbean Sea, northeast of Cuba. The Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine B-59 shuddered violently as another American practice depth charge exploded nearby. Inside the submarine's cramped combat information center, 3 officers stood in water that reached their ankles, the temperature hovering at 45 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Captain second rank, Valentin Grigorievich Savitsky, commanding officer of B-59, wiped sweat from his face and stared at the depth gauge. The submarine had been submerged for nearly 4 days, running on battery power that was nearly depleted. The air recycling system was failing. Carbon dioxide levels had reached dangerous concentrations. Men were collapsing from heat exhaustion. Another explosion rocked the submarine, closer this time. The lights flickered. In the darkness, Savitsky could hear his crew struggling to breathe in the toxic atmosphere. The Americans had been dropping these charges for 3 hours now, forcing B-59 deeper, preventing them from surfacing to recharge batteries or ventilate the hull. Savitsky turned to his second-in-command, Captain third-rank Ivan Maslennikov, and said words that would bring humanity to within minutes of extinction. "They are forcing us up. When we surface, they will destroy us. The war has already begun up there. We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Soviet Navy." The decision was made. B-59 would fire its Type 53-58 nuclear torpedo at the American destroyer group. The 10-kiloton warhead, 2/3 the power of the Hiroshima bomb, would vaporize the American ships and announce to the world that the Soviet Union was responding to what they believed was an American attack. Under Soviet Navy regulations, launching a nuclear weapon from a submarine required the agreement of 3 officers: the commanding officer, the political officer, and the second captain, a senior officer aboard to observe the mission. Savitsky had given the order. Maslennikov, the political officer, agreed immediately. The protocol was clear. 2 votes were sufficient to launch. But B-59 carried a 3rd officer whose vote was required by the specific command structure of this mission. Captain second rank Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, the flotilla commander who happened to be aboard B-59 as second captain, stood silently as his 2 colleagues prepared to destroy the American fleet and trigger World War III. What neither the Americans attacking B-59 nor the Soviet officers inside the dying submarine knew was that they were participating in the single most dangerous moment of the Cold War. A moment where protocol, miscommunication, and the physical breakdown of human judgment in extreme conditions brought 2 nuclear superpowers to the brink of annihilation. Arkhipov had seconds to make a decision. Say yes, and the nuclear torpedo would fire within 2 minutes. The Americans would respond. Soviet submarines would launch their weapons. Strategic forces would activate. The cascade of nuclear war would begin. Say no, and he would be contradicting his commanding officer in front of the crew, potentially facing court-martial for refusing to defend Soviet forces under attack. In the suffocating heat of B-59's Combat Information Center, with his commanding officer screaming orders to prepare the nuclear torpedo, Vasily Arkhipov had to decide whether 7 billion people would see another sunrise. To understand how close humanity came to extinction on October 27, 1962, one must understand the context that placed B-59 in the Caribbean and the circumstances that led 3 Soviet officers to believe nuclear war had already begun. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as it became known, began on October 14, 1962, when American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft photographed Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction in Cuba. President John F. Kennedy was informed on October 16th. For the next 13 days, the world would hover at the edge of nuclear war. The Soviet deployment represented an unprecedented escalation of Cold War tensions. The R-12 Divina missiles, designated SS-4 by NATO, could strike targets 2,000 kilometers away with 1 megaton nuclear warheads. From Cuba, they could reach Washington, D.C., New York, Atlanta, and most major American cities within 17 minutes of launch. No warning would be possible. The American response was immediate and massive. On October 22nd, Kennedy announced a naval quarantine of Cuba, a blockade by another name, to avoid the legal implications of an act of war. The U.S. Navy deployed 180 ships to enforce the quarantine line, established 800 kilometers from Cuban shores. Behind them stood the full might of American strategic forces, 1,479 strategic bombers on 15-minute alert, 156 intercontinental ballistic missiles fueled and targeted, and 144 submarine-launched ballistic missiles patrolling within range of Soviet territory. The Soviet Union responded by placing its own strategic forces on high alert. Marshal Rodion Malinowski, Soviet Minister of Defense, ordered all Soviet strategic forces to DEFCON equivalent readiness. The strategic rocket forces prepared 42 SS-6 and SS-7 ICBMs for launch. Long-range aviation dispersed 160 Tu-95 Bear and Tu-16 Badger bombers. Soviet submarine forces received orders to deploy to defensive positions around Cuba and offensive positions off the American coast. It was this last order that would bring B-59 to the Caribbean and Vasily Arkhipov to his fateful decision. On October 1, 1962, 3 weeks before Kennedy's announcement, 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines departed their base at Polyarny on the Kola Peninsula. B-4, B-36, B-59, and B-130 received orders to transit to Cuba, establishing a defensive submarine screen around the island and demonstrating Soviet resolve. Each Foxtrot carried a crew of 78 men, and was armed with 22 conventional torpedoes and 1 Type 53-58 nuclear torpedo. The nuclear weapon carried a 10-kiloton warhead and had a range of 19 kilometers. Soviet planners considered it a defensive weapon to be used only if the submarine was under attack and unable to escape. What made the October 1962 deployment extraordinary was that the submarines received authorization to use their nuclear torpedoes without additional approval from Moscow under specific circumstances, if the submarine came under attack and could not surface to communicate. This delegation of nuclear authority, unprecedented in Soviet military practice, reflected the Kremlin's understanding that submarines operating in American-controlled waters might face situations where communication was impossible and immediate response was necessary. The 4 submarines were commanded by the Soviet Navy's most experienced officers. Captain Second Rank Vasily Arkhipov, flotilla commander, was assigned to B-59 as second captain, a position that gave him equal authority with the commanding officer on matters of weapons release. His presence on B-59, rather than his flagship B-36, was a matter of scheduling and ship availability. This random assignment would prove to be the most consequential personnel decision in human history. Arkhipov, at 36 years old, was already a Soviet Navy hero. The previous year, he had been second in command of the nuclear submarine K-19 when its reactor cooling system failed during exercises in the North Atlantic. Arkhipov helped manage the damage control efforts that prevented a complete reactor meltdown. The crew jury-rigged a cooling system using the submarine's drinking water system, working in lethal radiation levels. 8 men died from radiation exposure within days. Arkhipov himself received a significant radiation dose, but survived. His experience on K-19 gave him a perspective his colleagues on B-59 lacked: intimate knowledge of what nuclear weapons could do, not just to the enemy, but to everyone. He had watched men die from radiation, their bodies destroyed from the inside. He understood nuclear war in visceral terms that most officers knew only theoretically. The 4 submarines departed Polyarny on October 1st, with orders to reach Cuba by October 20th. The transit would cover 11,000 kilometers across the Atlantic, around the British Isles, down the length of the Atlantic shipping lanes, and into the Caribbean. Soviet planners anticipated the transit would go undetected. American forces were focused on the missile sites in Cuba, not on submarine movements thousands of kilometers away. The submarines would maintain radio silence, running submerged during daylight hours and surfacing at night to recharge batteries and ventilate the hull. The Foxtrot class, while advanced by Soviet standards, was a diesel-electric design that could run submerged on batteries for only 4 to 6 days before requiring several hours on the surface to recharge. This limitation would prove critical. By October 23rd, when the submarines reached the quarantine line, American anti-submarine forces had been alerted to their presence. U.S. Navy P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft, equipped with sophisticated sonar buoys and magnetic anomaly detectors, located each submarine. What Soviet planners had assumed would be a covert deployment became a cat-and-mouse game, with the U.S. Navy holding overwhelming advantages. The American forces arrayed against the 4 Soviet submarines represented the most advanced anti-submarine warfare capability ever assembled. Task Force Alpha, commanded by Rear Admiral George Anderson, included 11 aircraft carriers, 25 destroyers equipped with active sonar, 12 submarines, and continuous air coverage from P-3 Orions and S-2 trackers. The American strategy was to track each Soviet submarine, force it to surface through persistent harassment, and then photograph and identify it, demonstrating American detection capabilities while stopping short of actual hostilities. The weapon of choice was the practice depth charge, a small explosive device that created a loud underwater detonation but caused no damage. The psychological effect on submariners, however, was profound. By October 26th, all 4 Soviet submarines were located and under constant American surveillance. B-59, commanded by Captain Savitsky with Arkhipov aboard as second captain, was operating northeast of Cuba when it was detected by the destroyer USS Coney. The American ship began the standard harassment procedure. Active sonar pinging and practice depth charges dropped in a pattern around the submarine. What the Americans did not know, what they had no way of knowing, was that each Soviet submarine carried a nuclear torpedo and had authorization to use it under certain conditions. The American crews, dropping practice depth charges, believed they were conducting routine anti-submarine operations. They were actually bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war. October 27th began as the most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In Moscow, Soviet leadership was preparing to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for American guarantees not to invade. In Washington, Kennedy and his advisors were considering the Soviet proposal while preparing for possible military action. In Cuba, Soviet and Cuban forces were on maximum alert, and 150 meters below the Caribbean, B-59 was dying. The submarine had been submerged since October 23rd, 4 days earlier. Standard procedure called for surfacing every 24 hours to run the diesel engines, recharge batteries, and ventilate the hull. But American forces had made surfacing impossible. Every time B-59 approached periscope depth, destroyers were waiting, forcing the submarine back down with active sonar and depth charges. By the morning of October 27th, conditions aboard B-59 had deteriorated to crisis levels. The batteries were at 18% capacity. The air recycling system, designed for a maximum 48 hours of continuous submerged operations, had been running for 96 hours and was failing. Carbon dioxide levels had reached 4,000 parts per million, 3 times the safe maximum. Oxygen levels had dropped to 16%, below the level where cognitive function begins to degrade. The heat was the worst of it. The submarine's internal temperature had risen above 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit, in the engine compartment. The crew quarters, though marginally cooler at 45 degrees Celsius, were still well beyond human tolerance for extended periods. Men were collapsing from heat exhaustion. The submarine's small medical team had administered the last of their electrolyte supplies. Some crew members had begun showing signs of delirium. Senior Lieutenant Vadim Pavlovich Orlov, the communications officer aboard B-59, later described the conditions. The temperature in the compartments was 45 to 50 degrees Celsius. It was unbearable. Some of the crew were half naked, stripped to their underwear. The air was so thick with carbon dioxide that you could see it shimmer. Men were falling unconscious. We were taking turns breathing from the submarine's compressed air system, 2 minutes each. It was like being in hell. Captain Savitsky, commanding the submarine, had been awake for over 40 hours. Sleep was impossible in the heat and noise. His decision-making was compromised by exhaustion, dehydration, and oxygen deprivation. His crew was on the edge of mutiny, not from disloyalty, but from the basic human need to breathe. They were begging him to surface, regardless of the Americans above. At 10:30 a.m. on October 27th, the USS Beale joined the USS Coney in dropping practice depth charges. The Americans were trying to signal the submarine to surface for identification, a standard procedure. The Soviet crew, unable to communicate with Moscow and having heard no radio traffic for days, had no way of knowing this. To them, the depth charges were attacks. The war they had been warned about had begun. The practice depth charges used by American destroyers were small, containing approximately 1.5 kilograms of explosive. They produced a loud bang, designed to be heard inside a submarine, but caused no structural damage, even at close range. But inside B-59, where crew members were already disoriented from carbon dioxide poisoning and sensory deprivation, the explosions sounded like full-scale anti-submarine weapons. At 10:52 a.m., after 3 hours of continuous depth charging, Captain Savitsky made his decision. According to multiple crew members who survived to provide testimony, including Orlov and several enlisted sailors, Savitsky called Maslennikov and Arkhipov to the Combat Information Center. "The Americans are trying to destroy us," Savitsky announced. "We have no communication with Moscow. For all we know, the war has started and we're receiving no orders because Moscow has been destroyed. We are within our authorization to respond with all weapons." The Type 5358 nuclear torpedo aboard B-59 was stored in tube number 2, already loaded and maintained at ready status throughout the patrol. The weapon was 7.2 meters long, 533 millimeters in diameter, and weighed 2,150 kilograms. Its 10-kiloton warhead could sink every ship within a 2-kilometer radius and would create a radioactive plume that would spread across hundreds of square kilometers of ocean. The firing procedure required approximately 2 minutes from the decision to launch. The torpedo's nuclear warhead had to be armed, a process requiring 2 separate keys turned simultaneously, one held by the commanding officer and one by the weapons officer. The torpedo tube had to be flooded and equalized with sea pressure. The outer door had to be opened. Then the launch command could be given. Savitsky had already turned his key. Maslennikov, the political officer, turned his. The weapons officer, following his captain's orders, began flooding tube number 2. The procedure was underway. Within 90 seconds, B-59 would fire a nuclear weapon at the American fleet. Under standard Soviet Navy regulations for conventional submarines, 2 officers were required to authorize weapons release: the commanding officer and the political officer. Both Savitsky and Maslennikov had agreed. The launch was authorized, but B-59 was not operating under standard regulations. Because the flotilla commander Arkhipov was aboard as second captain, Soviet Navy Command had designated a 3-officer authorization protocol for this specific mission. All 3 officers, Savitsky, Maslennikov and Arkhipov, had to agree before nuclear weapons could be used. This unusual protocol existed because Arkhipov's presence aboard B-59 created an ambiguity in the chain of command. Normally, the flotilla commander would be on his flagship B-36 and would exercise authority over all 4 submarines through radio communications. But Arkhipov was aboard B-59, making him both senior to Savitsky in the overall command structure and subordinate to him in the immediate submarine operations. To resolve this ambiguity, the Northern Fleet Command had issued specific orders. On matters of routine submarine operations, Savitsky commanded. On matters of weapons release, particularly nuclear weapons, all 3 senior officers must agree. This decision, made weeks earlier in a Polyarny conference room, would determine whether humanity survived October 27, 1962. In the Combat Information Center of B-59, Vasily Arkhipov stood in water that had condensed from the poisonous air, listening to his commanding officer describe why they needed to fire a nuclear torpedo at the American fleet. The scene was later reconstructed from multiple crew testimonies, though the exact words vary in different accounts. Savitsky: "We have no choice. They are destroying us. We must respond." Arkhipov remained silent, studying the depth charge plotting on the sonar display. The charges were landing in a pattern, approximately 1 every 5 minutes, in a circle around the submarine's estimated position. It was harassment, he realized, not an attack. If the Americans wanted to destroy B-59, they would use real depth charges or torpedoes. These explosions were signals, not weapons. Maslennikov: "Comrade Arkhipov, the captain is correct. We are under attack. We have authorization. We must defend the Soviet Union." Arkhipov looked at his 2 colleagues. Both were on the edge of psychological collapse. Their eyes were bloodshot from the carbon dioxide. Their skin was grey from dehydration. They had been underwater too long, in heat too intense, making decisions with brains that were literally starved of oxygen. He had seen this before, on K-19, when the radiation had driven men mad with fear and desperation. He had watched officers make terrible decisions because their minds could no longer function properly under extreme stress. He recognized the same symptoms now in Savitsky and Maslennikov. "Permission to speak, Captain," Arkhipov said formally, using protocol to slow the moment, to create time to think. Savitsky, surprised by the formality, nodded. "The charges are not depth charges designed to destroy submarines," Arkhipov said carefully. "They're too small, too regular. If the Americans wanted to sink us, we would be dead already. They're trying to signal us to surface." Savitsky exploded. According to Orlov's account, he screamed at Arkhipov, calling him a coward, accusing him of wanting to surrender to the Americans. Maslennikov joined the assault. In the confined space of the Combat Information Center, with half the crew within earshot, the confrontation was turning into a mutiny crisis. Arkhipov waited for the rage to exhaust itself. When Savitsky paused for breath, Arkhipov spoke again, his voice calm despite his own exhaustion. "I am not suggesting surrender. I'm suggesting we surface, establish communication with Fleet Command, and determine if war has actually begun before we fire a nuclear weapon that will kill us all." The logic was irrefutable. Even if B-59 successfully fired its nuclear torpedo and destroyed the American ships, the submarine would not survive the response. American submarines and aircraft would hunt down and destroy B-59 within hours. The crew would die either from American weapons or from asphyxiation in their damaged submarine. Firing the torpedo was suicide. But Savitsky was beyond rational argument. He ordered the weapons officer to continue the launch procedure. The torpedo tube was flooded, the outer door was opening, the weapon would be ready to fire in 30 seconds. What happened next is disputed in different accounts. Some sources claim Arkhipov physically prevented the launch by placing himself between Savitsky and the weapons panel. Others say he simply refused to give his authorization, forcing Savitsky to recognize that the protocol required unanimous agreement. Still others suggest that Maslennikov, convinced by Arkhipov's argument, withdrew his support, creating a deadlock. What is certain from all accounts is that the nuclear torpedo was not fired. The outer door of Tube 2 was closed. The tube was drained, and Arkhipov, having blocked the launch, now faced the problem of what to do next. B-59 could not remain submerged. The batteries were nearly dead. The air was becoming unbreathable. Men were dying. The only option was to surface and accept whatever consequences came from the Americans. At 11:17 a.m., 25 minutes after Savitsky had ordered the nuclear launch, B-59 began rising toward the surface. The decision to surface was Savitsky's, made on Arkhipov's recommendation, but it represented a complete reversal of the captain's position. In Soviet military culture, such reversals were shameful. Officers were expected to be decisive, unwavering. Savitsky had been overruled by a subordinate in front of his crew. His career was effectively over. But Arkhipov understood something Savitsky did not. Facing humiliation was better than ending the world. B-59 broke the surface at 11:23 a.m., approximately 200 kilometers northeast of Cuba. The submarine's diesel engines coughed to life, and the first fresh air in 4 days began flowing through the ventilation system. Men collapsed from relief, some crying, others vomiting from the sudden change in air pressure and composition. Above them, 11 American destroyers formed a circle around the surfaced submarine. The USS Coney approached to within 200 meters, its crew photographing the Soviet vessel. Helicopters from the carrier USS Randolph orbited overhead. It was the most intensive observation of a Soviet submarine ever conducted by American forces. What the Americans saw shocked them. The submarine was in terrible condition. Rust streaked its hull. Men were visible on the conning tower, their faces grey, moving slowly as if drugged. Some crew members climbed onto the deck and simply lay flat, spreading their arms to cool their bodies in the open air. Lieutenant William Ecker, flying an RF-8 Crusader reconnaissance aircraft over the scene, photographed B-59 extensively. His report noted, "The submarine appeared to be in distress. Personnel on deck showed signs of heat exhaustion. No hostile actions were observed." The American ships maintained their distance, neither approaching nor withdrawing. After 4 hours on the surface, during which B-59 recharged its batteries and the crew began to recover, the submarine received a radio message from Northern Fleet Command. "Return to base immediately. Do not engage American forces under any circumstances." The message meant Moscow had resolved the crisis diplomatically. The missiles were being removed from Cuba. The quarantine would be lifted. The submarines were to return to Soviet waters. World War III had been averted, though the crews of B-59 would not learn for years how close they had come to starting it. On October 28th, B-59 began its return transit to Polyarny. The journey took 3 weeks. During that time, Savitsky spoke to Arkhipov only when naval protocol required. The crew, understanding what had happened, quietly credited Arkhipov with saving their lives. But no official recognition could be given. To acknowledge Arkhipov's intervention would mean admitting that a submarine captain had nearly started a nuclear war. When B-59 reached Polyarny on November 19th, the crew was immediately debriefed by Soviet Navy intelligence and KGB officers. The events of October 27th were classified at the highest level. Crew members were ordered never to discuss what had happened. Savitsky was quietly reassigned to shore duties and retired from the Navy within 2 years. Arkhipov returned to submarine duty, eventually commanding the Soviet Navy's first Yankee-class ballistic missile submarines. For 40 years, the world knew nothing of how close it had come to nuclear war on October 27, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was remembered as a diplomatic success, Kennedy and Khrushchev managing to step back from the brink through careful negotiation. The submarine incidents were classified in both Soviet and American archives. The story began to emerge in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russian veterans of the Cuban crisis started speaking publicly about their experiences. At a 2002 conference in Havana, marking the 40th anniversary of the missile crisis, several participants from all three nations, Soviet, Cuban, and American, gathered to discuss the events. It was there that Vadim Orlov, the communications officer from B-59, publicly described what had happened aboard the submarine on October 27th. His testimony, corroborated by other surviving crew members, revealed for the first time that B-59 had been seconds away from launching a nuclear torpedo. Former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, attending the conference, turned pale as he listened to the translation of Orlov's testimony. "We were not aware," he said, "that Soviet submarines in the Caribbean carried nuclear weapons, nor that they had authority to use them. Had that torpedo been fired, we would have responded with nuclear weapons. There would have been no way to stop the escalation." Thomas Blanton, director of the National Security Archive, later calculated the probable timeline of what would have occurred if B-59 had fired its nuclear torpedo. Minute 0, B-59 fires 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo at USS Beale. The destroyer and two nearby ships, USS Coney and USS Murray, are destroyed instantly. Approximately 1,200 American sailors are killed. Minute 5. USS Randolph, the aircraft carrier coordinating anti-submarine operations, reports nuclear detonation. DEFCON 1 is declared automatically by NORAD protocols. Minute 12. President Kennedy is informed of the nuclear attack. Under PSYOP protocols, he has 15 minutes to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike before Soviet missiles can destroy American command and control. Minute 20. Kennedy, believing the Soviet attack on the American fleet signals the beginning of general war, authorizes nuclear response against Soviet submarines and Cuban targets. Minute 35. American aircraft drop nuclear depth charges on the three remaining Soviet submarines in the Caribbean. B-4, B-36, and B-130 are destroyed. Approximately 230 Soviet sailors are killed. Minute 42. American nuclear strikes hit Soviet military installations in Cuba, including missile sites and command bunkers. Casualties among Soviet and Cuban forces exceed 10,000. Minute 55. Soviet leadership, receiving reports of American nuclear attacks on their submarines and forces in Cuba, assumes general nuclear war has begun. Chairman Khrushchev authorizes full strategic response. Hour 2. Soviet SS-6 and SS-7 ICBMs launch from sites across the USSR. Approximately 42 missiles, carrying 60 nuclear warheads with yields between 1 and 5 megatons each, are targeted at American cities and military installations. Hour 2, minute 15. American early warning radar detects Soviet ICBM launch. NORAD confirms massive attack. President Kennedy authorizes full PSYOP response. Hour 2, minute 30. American Minuteman and Titan II ICBMs launch from silos across the United States. Approximately 150 missiles, carrying 450 warheads, are targeted at Soviet cities and military sites. Hour 3. The first Soviet warheads impact American targets. Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and 20 other cities are struck. Casualties exceed 50 million in the first hour. Hour 3, minute 30, the first American warheads impact Soviet targets. Moscow, Leningrad, Kyiv, and 25 other cities are destroyed. Soviet casualties exceed 40 million in the first hour. Hour 5. Both nations launch their remaining strategic forces. Britain and France, under NATO obligations, launch their nuclear weapons at Soviet targets. The Soviet Union responds by striking NATO facilities across Western Europe. Hour 8. Approximately 3,500 nuclear weapons have detonated across the Northern Hemisphere. Immediate casualties exceed 200 million. Fires burning in hundreds of cities are generating smoke plumes that are beginning to block sunlight. Day 2. Nuclear winter begins as smoke and soot from burning cities reach the stratosphere. Global temperatures begin to drop. Week 2. Radiation fallout across the Northern Hemisphere makes agriculture impossible. Food supplies begin to collapse. Month 3. Global temperatures have dropped 15 degrees Celsius. Crops are failing worldwide. Mass starvation begins. Year 1. Approximately 2 billion people have died from the direct effects of nuclear war, radiation, starvation, and disease. Human civilization as it existed in 1962 has collapsed. This timeline, reconstructed by nuclear strategists and historians, represents what would have followed if Vasily Arkhipov had said yes instead of no on October 27, 1962. The American participants at the 2002 Havana conference were shaken by the revelations about B-59. Admiral George Anderson, who had commanded Task Force Alpha during the crisis, admitted, "We were playing with fire and didn't know it. We thought we were conducting routine anti-submarine operations. We never imagined the Soviet submarines carried nuclear weapons or had authority to use them. If we had known, we would have been far more careful." The Soviet participants were equally disturbed by how close they had come to catastrophe. Orlov stated, "It was madness. We were dying in that submarine. Our minds were not functioning properly from the heat and the bad air. If it hadn't been for Arkhipov, I don't think Savitsky would have hesitated. He was desperate, we all were." The recognition of Arkhipov's role came slowly. He received no official Soviet award for his actions. The Soviet Navy, unwilling to admit how close their forces had come to triggering nuclear war, suppressed the story. Arkhipov returned to submarine duty and served with distinction, eventually reaching the rank of Vice Admiral. He retired in the mid-1980s and lived quietly outside Moscow. In 2002, Thomas Blanton, upon hearing the story of B-59 at the Havana conference, called Arkhipov the man who saved the world. The phrase caught on. When Arkhipov died in 1998, few people knew of his actions. But by the early 2000s, as the story spread, he was recognized internationally. In 2017, on what would have been Arkhipov's 91st birthday, the Future of Life Institute honored him posthumously with their Future of Life Award. The citation read, "Vasily Arkhipov, who prevented nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis through courage, wisdom, and judgment under the most extreme circumstances." Arkhipov never spoke publicly about October 27, 1962. In the few private conversations where he acknowledged the incident, he was characteristically modest. According to his widow Olga, he said, "I was just doing my duty, as I understood it. Someone had to remain calm. Someone had to think about the consequences beyond the immediate moment. But those who served with him on B-59 had a different perspective." Orlov, in a 2007 interview, stated, "Arkhipov saved all of us that day. Not just the crew of B-59, not just the Soviet Navy, but everyone. He had the moral courage to say no when every instinct, every order, every protocol was telling him to say yes. That kind of courage is rare. I think about it often. How many people alive today owe their lives to one man's decision to question his orders?" The broader implications of the B-59 incident were profound. It revealed that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most studied and analyzed near-miss of nuclear war, there had been a moment even more dangerous than policymakers realized. While Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated in Washington and Moscow, while the world watched missile sites in Cuba, the actual moment of maximum danger occurred in a Soviet submarine where three exhausted, oxygen-deprived officers were making life-or-death decisions without any contact with their governments. This realization led to significant changes in nuclear command and control procedures. Both the United States and Soviet Union implemented new protocols for situations where communications were lost and local commanders faced ambiguous circumstances. The principle that emerged was clear. When in doubt, don't launch. Escalation could always happen later, but once nuclear weapons were used, de-escalation became impossible. The B-59 incident also demonstrated the danger of delegating nuclear authority to operational commanders. The Soviet decision to give submarine captains authorization to use nuclear torpedoes without additional approval from Moscow, while logical in the context of submarine operations, where communication might be impossible, created a situation where the outbreak of nuclear war depended on the judgment of men who might be operating under extreme physical and psychological stress. Following the crisis, both nations revised their procedures to ensure that nuclear weapons release always required approval from the highest political authority, except in the most extreme circumstances where national survival was immediately threatened. The hair-trigger alert systems that had made the Cuban Missile Crisis so dangerous were gradually replaced by more robust command and control systems that provided more time for deliberation. The final statistics of what Vasily Arkhipov prevented with his decision on October 27, 1962, are both precise and horrifying. Date of incident: October 27, 1962, approximately 10:52 a.m. to 11:17 a.m. Duration of crisis: 25 minutes from launch order to decision to surface location. Caribbean Sea, 200 kilometers northeast of Cuba. Depth 150 meters. Soviet submarine. B-59, Foxtrot class. Crew of 78. Nuclear weapon aboard. One type, 53-58 torpedo. 10-kiloton warhead. American forces present. 2 aircraft carriers, multiple aircraft officers voting to launch nuclear torpedo. 2 of 3, Savitsky and Maslennikov for Arkhipov against. If torpedo had been fired, immediate casualties. Approximately 1,200 American sailors on 3 destroyers. Escalation timeline to full strategic exchange. 2 to 3 hours. American strategic arsenal in 1962. 3,267 nuclear warheads. Soviet strategic arsenal in 1962. 3,322 nuclear warheads. Warheads that would have been used in full exchange. To 3,000 immediate casualties from strategic exchange. 200 to 300 million total deaths within first year. 1.5 to 2 billion global population in 1962. 3.1 billion percentage of humanity saved by one man's decision. Approximately 50% to 65%. The crew of B-59 returned to normal duties after the crisis, though the psychological toll of their experience remained. Several crew members required medical treatment for heat-related injuries. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though Soviet military medicine did not acknowledge the condition at the time. Captain Savitsky never commanded another submarine. He was assigned to administrative duties and retired from the Navy in 1964 at age 45. He died in 1975, reportedly bitter about how his career had ended. In his personal papers, discovered after his death, was a single reference to the events of October 27th. I did what I thought was right at the time. History may judge me, but the men who second-guessed my decisions were not dying in that submarine with me. Captain Maslennikov continued in the Soviet Navy for several more years, but never discussed the incident. He died in 1987. Arkhipov's career flourished, though ironically not because of his actions on B-59. The Soviet Navy never officially acknowledged what had happened. His promotions came from his general competence and his reputation as a careful, thoughtful officer. He commanded several submarines, including some of the Soviet Navy's most advanced ballistic missile submarines. He retired as a vice admiral in 1985. In his final years, as the story of B-59 began to emerge publicly, Arkhipov was occasionally asked about the incident. His response was always the same. "I was fortunate to be in a position where I could make a difference. Many others would have done the same if they had been there instead of me." But those who studied the incident knew better. Not every officer would have had the courage to contradict his commanding officer. Not every officer would have remained calm enough under extreme physical duress to think clearly about the consequences. Not every officer would have risked his career, his reputation, and potentially his freedom to prevent what he knew would be a catastrophic mistake. Vasily Arkhipov had all these qualities, and on October 27, 1962, humanity needed exactly those qualities in exactly that place, at exactly that moment. The lesson of B-59 extends beyond the specific incident. It demonstrates that in the nuclear age, the fate of civilization can rest on the judgment of individual men and women facing impossible decisions under extreme circumstances. Systems, protocols, and safeguards matter, but ultimately, human judgment remains the final safeguard against catastrophe. The incident also reveals the terrifying fragility of nuclear deterrence. The carefully constructed logic of mutually assured destruction, the diplomatic communications, the hotlines between capitals, all of these mechanisms for preventing war became irrelevant when a submarine lost communication and 3 exhausted officers had to decide whether the world was ending. Dr. Bruce Blair, a former Minuteman launch officer who became a nuclear weapons expert, analyzed the B-59 incident in 2012. "What strikes me most is how close we came to nuclear war, not because of the actions of presidents or generals, but because of the decisions of 3 men in a submarine who had lost touch with reality, literally and figuratively. They couldn't communicate. They couldn't think clearly. They were operating on instinct and fear. That's the real danger of nuclear weapons, not that rational actors will use them deliberately, but that desperate actors will use them impulsively when circumstances degrade their judgment." In October 2012, on the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a ceremony was held in Moscow honoring the veterans of the submarine flotilla that had deployed to Cuba. Olga Arkhipova, Vasily's widow, attended and accepted recognition on his behalf. When asked what her husband would have thought about being called the man who saved the world, she replied, "He would have said that's too much. He was just a submarine officer doing his duty. But I think, secretly, he would have been pleased that people understood what was at stake that day." The ceremony included a reunion of surviving crew members from all 4 submarines. They were old men now, most in their 70s and 80s, but the bond forged in those terrifying days of October 1962 remained strong. They spoke of their experiences cautiously, still conditioned by decades of secrecy, but also with pride. They had been at the center of the most dangerous moment in human history, and through a combination of luck, courage, and one man's clear-headed judgment, they had survived. Vadim Orlov, at 72, summed up what many felt. "We think about it sometimes, those of us who are left. What if Arkhipov had said yes? What if he had been like Savitsky, desperate and angry and too exhausted to think clearly? The world would have ended. All our children, our grandchildren, none of them would exist. Everyone alive today owes their life to a decision made in 25 minutes by a man most of them have never heard of." So, On October 27, 1962, at 10:52 a.m., in a Soviet submarine 150 meters below the Caribbean Sea, 3 officers voted on whether to launch a nuclear torpedo at the American fleet. 2 said yes, 1 said no. That single vote cast by Captain Second Rank Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov prevented World War III and saved an estimated 2 billion lives. The submarine officers had voted to launch the nuclear torpedo, until one man's no saved 7 billion lives. The vote was 2-1, launch or don't end the world or save it. Arkhipov chose to save it, not because he was braver than his colleagues, not because he was wiser, but because he was calm enough in the moment of maximum chaos to ask a simple question: are we certain? That question, that moment of doubt in the face of certainty, that willingness to question orders when every instinct screamed to obey, saved humanity. The nuclear torpedo in Tube 2 of submarine B-59 was never fired. The 10-kiloton warhead that could have triggered Armageddon remained inert, and 7 billion people who would have died in the nuclear exchange that would have followed lived because one man, suffocating in a metal tube beneath the ocean, said the most important word in human history: no.